The cold dawn of 24 May 1941 carried a silence that did not belong to the North Atlantic. It was the silence that follows catastrophe. Only minutes earlier, the Royal Navy had watched its proudest symbol, HMS Hood, vanish in a single incandescent flash. One moment the battlecruiser surged forward through the Denmark Strait. The next, a column of flame tore through her decks, and the ship that had embodied British sea power for 2 decades broke apart in the frigid water. Out of a crew of more than 1,400, only 3 survivors remained. The blast was not just physical, it struck directly at the morale of a nation that still fought alone. In London, shock rippled through the Admiralty. The Hood had been more than steel and rivets. She was memory, pride, and the illusion of naval invincibility. To lose her so swiftly felt like losing an entire chapter of maritime history. Reports arrived in fragments, each confirming the same unbearable truth. The most feared ship in the Royal Navy had died in minutes. And so Britain, already battered by air raids and shortages at home, now faced a humiliation at sea that seemed almost biblical in scale. Across the channel, aboard the German battleship Bismarck, jubilation filled the steel corridors. To her officers, the destruction of the Hood proved what they had long believed, that Germany's new warship represented a pinnacle of naval engineering unmatched by any opponent. With her heavy armor, advanced fire control, and formidable guns, Bismarck appeared to stand beyond challenge. For a brief moment, her crew believed they had reshaped the balance of the Atlantic. Far away, however, in a quiet corner of a British airfield, a small group of pilots prepared an aircraft that seemed forgotten by time. The ferry Swordfish, an aging, fabric-covered biplane from another era, waited with wings folded, its design a relic of interwar compromise. No one looking at the machine could imagine it would soon play a decisive part in the fate of the German giant. Churchill's command cut through the despair like a blade. Sink the Bismarck. Yet beneath the resolve lay a quiet truth repeated throughout history. Victory often belongs not to the perfect machine, but to the imperfect one that arrives at the decisive moment. And somewhere beyond the horizon, that moment was beginning to gather shape. To German officers studying British naval aviation, the ferry Swordfish appeared little more than a curiosity. Its canvas-covered wings, fixed landing gear, and open cockpit belonged to a bygone age, not to the mechanized war that now raged across Europe. Some called it a relic, others, less politely, a flying museum piece. In wardrooms aboard Bismarck and Prince Eugen, pilots joked that the aircraft flew so slowly a flak gunner could track it with the naked eye. Their laughter carried the easy confidence of a navy convinced it understood every threat the enemy could muster. Yet hidden within the Swordfish's apparent frailty lay a trait few appreciated, its very slowness. At low altitude, the biplane handled with an almost uncanny steadiness. In torpedo runs, where precision mattered more than speed, this stability became a quiet advantage. While modern monoplanes shuddered under strain, the Swordfish held its line like a patient hand guiding a blade. It was not elegant, not modern, but it was dependable. And war, more often than not, rewards dependability over beauty. The men who flew it understood its limitations intimately. Many trained in foul weather over the channel, coaxing their aging engines through wind and spray. Their aircraft were older than many of the pilots themselves, their frames creaking with every sudden turn. They learned to read subtle changes in pitch, to feel the aircraft's fabric skin tug against the air, and to trust its simplicity when more advanced machines faltered. To them, the Swordfish was not an embarrassment. It was a tool, unrefined but ready. Inside the Admiralty, no one pretended otherwise. The Swordfish was outdated, a stopgap kept in service because Britain had no alternative. Newer designs existed on paper, but the war demanded what could fly today, not tomorrow. And so the Royal Navy accepted the irony. Its only carrier-borne torpedo bomber was a design rooted in the interwar years, held together by reliability rather than innovation. Meanwhile, German confidence swelled. Encased in armor and protected by advanced anti-aircraft batteries, Bismarck seemed untouchable. No rational commander believed a fabric-skinned biplane could pierce such defenses. But confidence, when left unchallenged, ripens into arrogance, and an enemy dismissed too easily becomes an enemy misunderstood. Wars are rarely decided by expectations. More often, they pivot on overlooked capabilities, quiet strengths hiding in plain sight. And soon, over the churning Atlantic, those overlooked wings would begin their slow, deliberate approach. Across the breadth of the Atlantic, the Royal Navy stirred with a sense of urgency it had not felt in decades. Orders crackled across wireless sets, summoning battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and aircraft carriers into motion. The loss of the Hood had transformed the pursuit of Bismarck from a strategic operation into a national imperative. What followed became one of the largest maritime hunts in British history, a vast net of steel stretching across thousands of miles of restless ocean, each vessel searching for the same solitary shadow on the waves. Bismarck, though wounded, remained dangerous. A British shell had struck below her waterline, allowing seawater to seep deep into her bow, slowing her advance. Yet her engines still turned, her guns remained intact, and her armor held firm. Admiral Gunther Lütjens, commanding from the bridge, set a steady course toward France, where air cover and repair facilities waited. The worsening Atlantic weather seemed to offer protection, broad sheets of rain and shifting fog banks that obscured even the largest ship. To Lütjens, the storm was not an obstacle, it was a shield. Far to the south, the carrier Ark Royal raced to intercept, her deck crowded with the dark silhouettes of swordfish torpedo bombers. Their pilots understood the stakes with a clarity sharpened by loss. They were not expected to sink the Bismarck outright. Their task was simpler and far more perilous, to cripple her, to buy time for the surface fleet battering through the storm behind them. Every man aboard knew that history had a habit of turning on efforts exactly like this, quiet and desperate, undertaken far from home. But the ocean proved an adversary of its own. Signals arrived distorted, reconnaissance aircraft returned empty-handed, and false reports scattered the fleet across widening arcs of search. At one point, Bismarck vanished entirely from the Admiralty's plotting tables, slipping into the gray void like a ghost. For hours, the chase teetered on the edge of collapse. Then, abruptly, the weather lifted. Clouds thinned, visibility stretched, and a Catalina flying boat glimpsed a dark shape cutting through the waves. The window was narrow, perhaps only a few hours, but it was enough. On the flight deck of Ark Royal, engines coughed to life as crews prepared for a torpedo strike that would test the limits of both machine and man. The wind rolled across the carrier in violent bursts, rattling the fragile wings of each aircraft. As the first swordfish lifted into the storm, its fabric skin trembling against the gale, the contrast could not have been sharper. A biplane from another era rising into the sky in pursuit of the most powerful warship afloat. And ahead, somewhere beyond the curtain of rain, awaited a target few believed it could reach. To the architects of German naval doctrine, Bismarck represented the summit of maritime engineering, a warship conceived to withstand not just gunfire, but the changing nature of modern combat itself. Her designers had studied the lessons of the First World War with cold precision, reinforcing her hull with thick armor belts and subdividing her interior into a maze of watertight compartments. In theory, no single torpedo could disable her. Damage might slow her, might inconvenience her, but it would not stop her. The ship was built to absorb punishment and continue forward, a steel expression of national ambition. Below her waterline, this philosophy became even more pronounced. Heavy armor shielding wrapped around her vital spaces, creating a layered defense unmatched by any contemporary battleship. Fuel tanks were interlaced with protective voids, machinery isolated from flooding by reinforced bulkheads. Every plate, every rivet served the same purpose, to ensure that Bismarck would survive the kind of underwater blow that had doomed earlier generations of ships. Against such protection, the idea that a torpedo dropped from a slow biplane could inflict meaningful harm seemed almost absurd. Above deck, her anti-aircraft defenses completed the image of invulnerability. With 105 heavy guns forming the outer ring of fire and 37 M20 cannons layered closer in, the ship bristled with weapons designed to tear apart incoming aircraft. German gunners trained for the speed of modern attack planes, sleek monoplanes diving at hundreds of miles per hour, leaving only seconds to respond. The swordfish, ambling through the sky at barely more than 100 knots, fell outside their expectations entirely. Its slowness, paradoxically, made it a more difficult target to predict, yet no one aboard imagined such an anachronistic machine would dare approach them. Morale aboard Bismarck burned high after the destruction of the Hood. The crew had witnessed what their ship could achieve when unleashed, and the memory of that great explosion still echoed through their conversations. For many sailors, the battle confirmed a belief already held, that Germany had produced not just a powerful warship, but a symbol of renewed naval prestige. Confidence settled over the ship like a second armor, intangible, but no less real than the steel plating around them. In Berlin, the Kriegsmarine leadership viewed Bismarck as more than a tactical asset. She stood as proof that German industry, guided by meticulous engineering and unbroken resolve, could rival and surpass the world's leading navies. Her very presence in the Atlantic challenged British assumptions about dominance at sea. As long as Bismarck remained afloat, she embodied possibility of disrupted convoys, shattered morale, and a reshaped maritime war. Yet confidence carries its own weight, and in wartime it often obscures shadows hiding at the edge of vision. In their admiration for Bismarck's strength, few examined her operational vulnerabilities with equal rigor. Her reconnaissance options were limited. Her fuel situation was precarious. Her chain of command, disciplined but rigid, left little room for improvisation. And her aura of invincibility encouraged the belief that certain threats simply did not matter. The irony deepened with every passing hour. Arrogance is often carved into defeat long before the decisive blow is struck. And far beyond the horizon, the fragile wings of the swordfish continued their slow advance, carrying with them a danger the giant had not been built to understand. Somewhere in the approaching storm, the first cracks in that confidence were waiting to emerge. In London, Winston Churchill demanded updates with a regularity that betrayed the weight of the moment. The destruction of the Hood had shaken not only the Royal Navy, but the nation's confidence in its own endurance. Britain, still standing alone against a continent under German control, could not afford another symbolic blow. Each telegram from the Admiralty, each revised position estimate, became part of a ritual of vigilance. Churchill understood that if Bismarck reached the safety of French ports, the strategic balance of the Atlantic would tilt in a way Britain could scarcely bear. Inside the Admiralty itself, the swordfish became an object of renewed scrutiny. Officers who had long acknowledged the aircraft's obsolescence found themselves forced to reconsider it through the lens of necessity. The biplane was exposed to the elements, slow against the wind, and vulnerable to even moderate anti-aircraft fire. Yet it possessed qualities that, in the narrow calculus of survival, mattered more. It could operate from carrier decks in turbulent seas, launch in near darkness, and attack from altitudes too low for advanced targeting systems. What modern designs promised in theory, the swordfish delivered in practice: reliability when everything else faltered. On the deck of Ark Royal, this reassessment became tangible. Crews worked openly with tools and torpedo casings, modifying warheads to perform in the rough Atlantic swell. Standard magnetic detonators proved unreliable in storm conditions, so they were replaced with contact pistols, simple mechanical, less prone to failure. The adjustments were improvised, done in full view of the North Atlantic wind, yet the men approached each step with quiet deliberation. They understood that the strike, if it came, would have to be perfect. The pilots absorbed these realities without illusion. They knew the odds. A torpedo run against a battleship protected by layered anti-aircraft fire bordered on suicidal. But their professionalism, honed in years of training often dismissed as routine, steadied them. There were no speeches, no dramatic declarations, only the methodical preparation of maps, compasses, and checklists, and the unspoken recognition that they were being asked to achieve what larger, more modern aircraft could not. In an age defined by machinery, it was their steadiness as individuals that mattered most. Across Britain, the public learned that the coming confrontation hinged on men flying aircraft older than many of the pilots themselves. In newspapers and on radio broadcasts, the contrast became part of the national narrative. The world's most advanced battleship hunted by a biplane whose lineage stretched back to the early years of aviation. Yet instead of despair, the image sparked something else, a sense of belief rooted not in the machine, but in the people guiding it. Britain had endured worse odds before. It understood that determination, when coupled with skill, could tilt events in unexpected ways. This belief grew quietly within the fleet as well. Even an obsolete tool can become decisive when wielded with precision, and in the hands of those who know its limits intimately. The swordfish was not perfect. It did not need to be. It only needed an opening, one brief moment where its peculiar strengths aligned with the enemy's single point of weakness. And ahead, concealed within the storm that Bismarck trusted as an ally, lay a blind spot the Germans had never imagined a biplane could exploit. The storm tightened its grip on the Ark Royal as the Wordfish crews moved across the deck, their figures blurred by sheets of wind-driven rain. Gusts slammed against the carrier with such force that men had to brace themselves against the railings, leaning their weight into the gale simply to remain upright. Waves rose and fell in steep, irregular walls, lifting the ship in one moment and hurling it down the next. It was weather that seemed designed to halt flight operations entirely, yet it was in this chaos that the next chapter of the chase would unfold. For the crews, the storm was no longer an inconvenience. It was the medium through which they would be forced to work. Aboard Bismarck, German officers interpreted these conditions as a safeguard. No reasonable commander, they believed, would send a biplane into such violent air. The storm, they assumed, rendered the Atlantic temporarily impermeable to aviation, especially the slow, ungainly swordfish. Their confidence grew from a simple premise. Modern aircraft struggled in such turbulence, therefore older ones must fare even worse. It was a conclusion built on logic, but not on experience, and it created a gap between expectation and reality wide enough for history to pass through unnoticed. On the carrier deck, the swordfish pilots knelt over their charts and checklists, reviewing the sequence of a torpedo run conducted at barely 50 feet above the surface. At that altitude, the margin for error narrowed to the width of a heartbeat. Too high, and the torpedo would strike the water at the wrong angle. Too low, and the aircraft risked clipping the crest of an unseen wave. They rehearsed the procedure with a methodical calm, aware that precision, not bravery, would determine whether they survived the approach. These were not men seeking glory. They were craftsmen preparing a difficult task. It was in these conditions that the swordfish's antiquated design revealed a hidden virtue. Unlike faster monoplanes, whose thin wings stalled abruptly in turbulent air, the biplane's broad lifting surfaces allowed it to remain controllable even in the storm's uneven gusts. The fabric's skin flexed, absorbing shocks that would have torn metal sheeting apart. The aircraft did not fight the wind, it bent with it. What had made the swordfish seem outdated in peacetime, its slowness, its softness, now allowed it to stay airborne when modern designs might have faltered. The contrast sharpened with each passing minute. German reliance on technology had produced a battleship of extraordinary complexity, a vessel built to dominate through engineering supremacy. Britain, lacking the luxury of perfection, relied instead on adaptability. Torpedoes modified on deck, flight plans revised mid-storm, pilots trained to coax frail machinery through unforgiving skies. It was not innovation in the traditional sense, but resilience, an ability to function when conditions stripped away every advantage. As the swordfish were rolled into launch position, the storm ceased to be merely weather. It became an accomplice, masking their approach, concealing their movements, and testing their resolve with every violent gust. In the interplay between steel and fabric, between confidence and necessity, the stage was set for a confrontation no doctrine had anticipated. Sometimes weakness is strength in disguise, and soon, over the darkened Atlantic, that disguise would begin to fall away. The first swordfish strike did not begin with triumph, but with a mistake born of urgency. As the biplanes lifted from Ark Royal's heaving deck, their crews carried intelligence reports indicating a contact to the northeast, presumed to be Bismarck. Amid the storm, with visibility fractured into shifting curtains of rain, the pilots flew low and fast toward the position relayed to them. What they found instead was not a German battleship, but the British cruiser Sheffield, assigned to shadow the enemy. In the gray half-light of the Atlantic, friend and foe blurred into a single silhouette, and the swordfish released their torpedoes before recognition took hold. The consequences should have been catastrophic. The torpedoes streaked toward the cruiser, their wakes white against the dark water. Yet as they neared Sheffield, the warheads failed to detonate. Instead, they broke the surface, veered erratically, and plunged into the sea without effect. The defect lay in the magnetic pistols, new, supposedly advanced mechanisms designed to detonate beneath a ship's hull. In practice, they were unreliable, vulnerable to the interference of rough seas and the Earth's magnetic variations. What was intended as a technological leap had instead become a hazard to the fleet it was meant to protect. For the swordfish crews, the realization cut deeply. They had risked their lives only to discover that the very weapons they depended upon could not be trusted. Returning to Ark Royal, they landed in an atmosphere of shaken resolve. The storm still raged, the hunt remained urgent, and now one more. Uncertainty had entered the equation. Their next sortie would likely be their final chance to strike Bismarck before she reached safety, and the tools at hand were proving unpredictable. It was a reminder that aviation in maritime warfare was still an evolving art, shaped by trial, error, and the unforgiving reality of combat. But the response was swift. On the carrier's deck, torpedomen and armorers worked with disciplined intensity, stripping magnetic pistols from the remaining torpedoes and replacing them with older contact detonators. The modification was crude but dependable, a mechanical striker triggered only upon direct impact. It lacked sophistication, yet its simplicity became an asset in the storm-lashed Atlantic. The task, which might have required hours under normal conditions, was completed in a fraction of that time. Men labored soaked to the skin, passing tools hand to hand as the wind tore across the deck. Each torpedo modified was another chance reclaimed. The mistaken attack also exposed the broader difficulty of anti-surface aviation, a discipline that demanded precise coordination between technology, intelligence, and weather. A misread position, a moment of unclear visibility, or a single equipment failure could cascade into disaster. Britain's pilots did not have the luxury of modern instrumentation or stable skies. Their work required a blend of instinct, training, and calm under pressure, each factor weighed against the shifting variables of the sea. The strike on Sheffield served as a brutal reminder that even well-prepared operations could unravel in the face of incomplete information. Yet the cruiser's survival proved critical. Unscathed, Sheffield continued shadowing Bismarck, transmitting position reports that finally narrowed the search corridor. Had she been lost, the Royal Navy would have been forced to broaden its pursuit once again, losing precious hours in a race already stretched to its limits. Chance, more than design, preserved the fragile thread connecting hunter and prey. Among the swordfish crews, the near disaster focused their determination. They understood now that the next attack would not be a rehearsal or a probing strike. It would be the decisive moment upon which the entire operation hinged. The storm still pressed down upon them. Bismarck continued her push toward France, and the fleet behind them strained to close the gap. One final opportunity remained, a narrow window shaped by weather, timing, and the endurance of men exhausted by the chase. And as the modified torpedoes were secured beneath the wings of the waiting swordfish, the crews prepared to launch once more, knowing that this time the margin for error had vanished entirely. Evening settled over the Atlantic in shades of iron and ash as 14 swordfish edged into launch position on Ark Royal's trembling deck. The storm had not passed. It had only changed character, becoming denser, heavier, as if the sky itself wished to press the aircraft back into the carrier's hold. But one by one, each biplane lurched forward, its engine clawing at the wind until the wheels left the deck. The crews felt the immediate violence of the air, gusts that slapped the wings, sudden drops that threatened to pull the aircraft into the sea. This was not a flight so much as a negotiation with the elements, sustained only by the pilot's grip and the swordfish's stubborn will to stay aloft. Below them, waves rose like dark monoliths, breaking into white spray that sometimes reached the undersides of the aircraft. Visibility contracted to a shifting tunnel of gray. Even the formation struggled to hold together as the storm scattered them across the sky. Engines sputtered under the weight of the wind, catching again only through the pilot's delicate adjustments. The torpedoes slung beneath the wings added drag, making every maneuver sluggish. Yet they pressed forward, guided by compass bearings, approximated positions, and a steady faith in the navigation crews aboard Ark Royal. The men knew that if they failed to find their target now, there would be no second chance. On Bismarck, radar operators scanned their screens through sheets of interference. The storm that hindered the swordfish also distorted German detection systems, scattering returns and masking inbound aircraft. By the time the swordfish appeared on the scopes, they were already close, too close for a leisurely defensive response. Alarms rang out, and the battleship's anti-aircraft batteries snapped to life, rising from silence into a coordinated thunder. Tracers carved bright arcs across the darkening sky, each one a brief, burning line that illuminated the raging sea. The flak wall Bismarck unleashed was immense. Heavy 105mm shells burst in great black blossoms, scattering fragments designed to tear wings apart. Closer in, 37mm and 20mm cannons spat fire at terrible speed, filling the air with a lattice of metal. Any conventional aircraft, sleek, fast, and rigid, would have been forced into evasive maneuvers that broke the accuracy of its torpedo run. But the swordfish, slow and pliant, behaved differently. Their pace confounded the German fire control predictors calibrated for swift modern attackers. Calculated intersections failed. Shells detonated ahead or behind instead of directly upon them. What had been a disadvantage in every previous theater of war became, in this single confrontation, an unexpected strength. Flying just meters above the wave tops, the pilots felt the sea's texture beneath them, the spray striking their goggles, the sudden upward thrusts of wind that lifted them a meter too high, the downdrafts that pushed them dangerously low. In open cockpits, the roar of the elements drowned out everything except the pulse of their engines. Each man understood the geometry of the task ahead. To launch a torpedo effectively, they would have to hold altitude, maintain direction, and commit to a straight run directly into the densest path of enemy fire. There was no room for improvisation. Precision was the only shield they possessed. Amid the flak, the biplanes advanced as if pushing through a burning curtain. Pilots locked their eyes on the shape of Bismarck emerging intermittently through the mist, a vast, dark fortress battling the storm as fiercely as the attack itself. The battleship's great guns elevated, unable to depress far enough to track the low-flying swordfish, leaving the smaller anti-aircraft mountings to shoulder the defense. Explosions burst so close that shockwaves rocked the fragile aircraft, yet the pilots held their lines, trusting that the old Fabricant steel frames could absorb more punishment than intuition suggested. Inside every cockpit lay the same quiet calculation. They needed only one hit. One well-placed torpedo could determine whether Bismarck continued toward France or was forced to turn helplessly into the teeth of the pursuing fleet. The pilots did not know who among them would deliver that strike, or even whether they would live to see its effect. Their duty was simply to press forward, to fly the final meters through the storm, through the fire, through the convergence of history and necessity. And as the swordfish closed to torpedo launch range, each aircraft aligned for its run, preparing to release the weapons that might alter the fate of the Atlantic. The critical moment lay just beyond the next burst of flak, waiting for the first pilot brave enough to commit. The swordfish closed to attack range in a loose, wind-torn formation, each aircraft fighting the storm as fiercely as the gunfire erupting from Bismarck's decks. When the first torpedo finally struck the water, its wake ran straight and white toward the battleship's towering hull. Moments later, a second fell away from another swordfish, then a third. 30 knots of steel met the storming Atlantic with a hiss, and beneath the roar of engines and flak, the pilots could only hold their lines and hope the weapons found their mark. They would not know, until much later, which of them had reshaped the battle. Among the torpedoes racing toward the German giant, one approached Bismarck's port side aft, an angle rarely studied in doctrine, rarely tested in simulations, and never anticipated in the ship's design. As it closed the final meters, the battleship heeled slightly amid rough seas, exposing a vulnerable span of armor above her rudder. The explosion that followed was not large compared to the blasts that tore through earlier naval battles, yet its effect was immediate and devastating. The shock reverberated through the stern, wrenching the rudder into a fixed angle and jamming it there. An improbable strike had found the smallest seam in the armor of a ship built to withstand far greater blows. Deep within the engineering compartments, crews reacted instantly. They attempted to isolate the flooding, assess structural distortion, and regain manual control of the rudder. Voices echoed through the steel chambers as men worked by lantern light, the storm shaking the ship with every passing wave. They rigged chains and applied hydraulic force, hoping to free the mechanism, but the blast had twisted metal into a shape the equipment could no longer command. Above them, the ship's blades still turned with full power, yet they could no longer obey the helm. The effect revealed itself on the ocean's surface. Instead of cutting cleanly toward France, Bismarck began to drift, then gradually turn, the vast hull carving a broad, involuntary arc across the waves. Officers on the bridge watched the compass shift with growing disbelief. Radio messages carried the news upward through the chain of command. The battleship was no longer steerable. Despite all its armor, all its engineering, all its power, the pride of the Kriegsmarine had been forced into a slow, helpless circle by a single torpedo dropped from an aircraft derided as obsolete. For the crew, the realization settled. In stages, confusion, then frustration, and finally a quiet shock. They had prepared for damage, certainly, but not for this kind of damage. A wound that left the ship strong enough to fight yet unable to flee. The engines roared at full power, the boilers burned hot, but Bismarck could not answer her helm. Battleships were built to dominate open water. Few things felt more unnatural than watching one become a captive of its own momentum. In London, the Admiralty received the first reports with cautious disbelief. For hours, they had feared the torpedo strike would fail, as earlier weapons had, or that the swordfish would be shot down before achieving effect. Yet here was confirmation. Bismarck was crippled, her course no longer her own. Relief did not appear as celebration, but as a long, controlled exhale, a quiet acknowledgement that Britain's darkest naval loss might yet be answered. Churchill, informed of the development, understood its magnitude instantly. A single hit had reopened the door to victory. The moment carried a deeper truth, one repeated throughout the annals of warfare. Great machines rarely fail through their strengths. They fail through the smallest overlooked flaws, through a jammed bolt, a misaligned bearing, a vulnerability no engineer imagined worth guarding. Bismarck's designers had prepared for battleship shells, for torpedoes striking amidships, for catastrophic flooding. They had not considered that one well-placed weapon, delivered under impossible conditions by an airplane from another era, might strike the one point where preparation thinned into assumption. As the storm raged on and the battleship traced its involuntary circle across the Atlantic, the Royal Navy began closing in, preparing for the final act. The swordfish had done their part. Now, the giants of steel behind them would take up the pursuit. The morning of 27 May 1941 rose over an Atlantic transformed. Bismarck, once the most feared surface raider in the world, now drifted in a widening arc, unable to answer her rudder. Her engines still churned with the power of a great warship, but without steering, all that force could do was push her in circles. This single vulnerability, exposed by a single torpedo, rewrote the geometry of the hunt. For the first time since Hood was lost, the Royal Navy no longer chased shadows. It pursued a fixed point on the map. From the north and west, two British battleships closed the distance. King George V, flagship of the home fleet, and HMS Rodney, a massive older vessel whose 16-inch guns were the largest carried by any British warship. Both ships had steamed at flank speed through the night, their boilers pushed to limits normally avoided in peacetime. The men aboard knew what this day meant. They had seen photographs of Hood displayed in canteens, read the casualty lists that filled entire columns of newspapers, and heard the radio broadcasts asking a nation to endure one more hardship. Now the responsibility of answering that loss traveled with them across the waves. As dawn broke, mist thinned just enough to reveal a dark silhouette to the south, Bismarck, rolling slightly in the heavy swell. She still looked formidable, her turrets stark against the horizon, but the subtle asymmetry of her movement betrayed her condition. Admiral Tovey aboard King George V ordered the engagement to begin. Moments later, Rodney opened fire. The roar of her forward guns reverberated across the sea, followed by the rising howl of shells cutting through the air. Their impact blossomed against Bismarck's hull in violent bursts, sending shudders down her length. Bismarck answered as best she could. Her forward turrets trained on the British ships, firing salvos that sent plumes of water skyward. But the lack of steering made target acquisition nearly impossible. Each time the gunners corrected their aim, the ship's involuntary turn shifted the angle again. The German crew fought with discipline, maintaining rate of fire even as the deck bucked beneath them, but the gap between their intent and their capability widened with every minute. Soon, British shells began to find more critical marks. One struck near Bismarck's superstructure, damaging her fire control systems. Another disabled a forward turret. Smoke enveloped the ship in dark columns, obscuring her silhouette and turning the once-proud battleship into a battered hulk fighting for breath. The storm that had battered the Swordfish now carried the sound of hammering artillery far across the waves, an echo of the mechanical struggle unfolding at close range. Inside Bismarck, the atmosphere shifted from disciplined urgency to a quiet, stunned recognition. Men who had cheered the destruction of Hood now watched their own ship's instruments flicker and fail. Rangefinders cracked from concussive blasts. Turrets stalled or jammed. Flooding spread where bulkheads had been warped by repeated impacts. The ship had not yet sunk, but she had lost the cows. Iron that makes a warship more than steel. She was fighting not to win, but simply to endure. On the bridge, officers confronted the reversal with a calm born of training rather than hope. They had gone to sea expecting to challenge convoys, perhaps even duel with British capital ships on equal terms. Instead, they faced an opponent granted overwhelming advantage by a single mechanical failure, an outcome neither their doctrine nor their pride had ever fully contemplated. The laughter that once followed mention of British biplanes was gone, replaced by the bitter clarity of hindsight. It was the Swordfish, improbable and outdated, that had brought them to this point. The British battleships closed to unusually short range, their guns firing with devastating accuracy. Rodney's shells smashed into the superstructure, tearing away observation posts and reducing gun positions to broken metal. King George V, maintaining a more measured rate of fire to conserve ammunition, struck repeatedly along the hull. Each impact deepened the damage, pushing Bismarck closer to the inevitable. For the British crews, there was no triumph in the destruction, only the heavy responsibility of ending a threat and avenging the sailors lost aboard Hood. By mid-morning, Bismarck was barely recognizable as the ship that had once dominated the Denmark Strait. Her guns had fallen silent, her decks burned, her hull listing lower with each passing wave. Yet she continued to absorb punishment, held afloat by the very strength that had once made her seem invincible. It took torpedoes from circling destroyers to deliver the final blows, rupturing what remained of her structural integrity. Moments later, the great battleship began her slow descent, sliding beneath the Atlantic in a shroud of smoke and foam. The giants of the Royal Navy turned away, their work complete. Behind them, the sea closed over the wreck of a ship once thought unsinkable, a monument to what strength can achieve and to how quickly it can unravel. Ahead, the story of that unraveling would pass from steel to memory, carried by ships returning home through the quieting storm. As the battle wore on, Bismarck became a landscape of spreading fires and failing steel. Flames licked across the upper decks, fed by ruptured fuel lines and shattered equipment. Smoke billowed upward in thick, wind-torn columns that obscured the sky, turning the morning light into a muted, copper-colored haze. Below the waterline, compartments flooded in slow succession. Each new breach forced sailors to abandon positions they had occupied moments earlier, retreating through narrowing corridors illuminated only by flickering emergency lamps. The heart of the ship beat unevenly, pulsing with the strain of machinery pushed beyond the limits of endurance. In the engine rooms, engineers continued their work even as the temperature climbed and the decks trembled beneath their boots. They labored with the unspoken understanding that escape routes were vanishing with each passing minute. Pumps were redirected to stem flooding. Valves were adjusted by hand in the glow of lanterns shaken by concussive blasts. Their orders were simple and absolute: keep the ship alive for as long as possible. Duty in these final moments became an anchor, holding them steady even as the ship around them faltered. Many would not reach the ladders that led to the upper decks. They knew this, yet continued their tasks with the same stoicism that had defined the German naval tradition. Above them, the situation deteriorated further. Communication lines, already compromised by earlier hits, began to fail entirely. Messages that once moved crisply between the bridge, gun crews, and engineering sections dissolved into fragmented echoes or vanished in the static. Officers relied on runners who fought through smoke-filled passageways, delivering orders by memory when written instructions became impossible to read. Yet even these pathways soon filled with debris and water, cutting the ship into isolated pockets of men fighting their own private battles for survival. Near mid-morning, the British cruiser Dorsetshire closed in to deliver the final torpedoes. With Bismarck's guns silent and her defensive capabilities shattered, the attack unfolded with grim inevitability. The first torpedo struck amidships, sending a deep shudder through the hull. The second, launched moments later, found a critical point along the starboard side. The explosions accelerated the flooding already surging through the lower compartments, pushing the ship past the threshold of buoyancy. The sea began to claim her in earnest. On deck, the order to abandon ship spread unevenly, carried by shouted commands and gestures rather than intact communication lines. Men gathered at the rails, their uniforms torn and blackened by smoke, their faces streaked with oil. Some leapt into the cold Atlantic without hesitation. Others paused, staring for a final moment at the ship that had carried their hopes across the ocean. The water below churned with debris, fuel slicks, and rising waves that threatened to pull swimmers beneath the surface. Rescue would come, but not quickly enough. Hundreds were lost in the tumult, swept away by currents, trapped beneath wreckage, or overcome by the bitter cold within minutes. Among the officers who remained aboard until the end, a quiet reflection took hold. They understood the symbolic weight of their ship. The pride of German engineering, the vessel once believed nearly invulnerable. Yet its fate had turned not on a duel of giants, but on the impact of a torpedo delivered by an aircraft they had openly dismissed. The contrast was inescapable. The swordfish, slow, fragile, almost archaic, had exploited a weakness hidden beneath layers of confidence and steel. The irony was sharp, yet no one voiced it aloud. In the final hour of a warship, silence often says more than words can bear. As the list to starboard increased, men clung to railings or scrambled across slanted decks now slick with oil and seawater. The great turrets, once symbols of offensive power, hung motionless, stripped of purpose. Water surged over the starboard side, climbing with relentless certainty. A deep groaning sound emanated from the hull, the death knell of a structure finally surrendering to gravity and the sea. Then with a slow and heavy roll, Bismarck capsized. The massive hull lifted briefly into view, its underside exposed to the sky, before slipping beneath the Atlantic in a surge of foam. Within moments, only debris and scattered survivors remained, drifting upon waves that began to settle now that the guns had fallen silent. The sea closed over the wreck, leaving no trace of the ship that had dominated headlines and weighed so heavily on the minds of nations. For the victors, the moment brought no celebration. The destruction of Bismarck marked the end of a threat, but also the end of hundreds of lives bound by duty to their vessel. The silence that followed felt heavier than triumph, shaped by an understanding older than war itself. That victory, when measured in lives, carries its own burden. And as the British ships searched the waters for survivors, the storm that had witnessed the battle drifted slowly eastward, leaving behind a quiet that seemed to acknowledge the tragedy shared by both sides. As the echoes of battle faded into the vastness of the Atlantic, British destroyers eased their way through waters still churned by debris and drifting oil. The sea was scattered with the remnants of a great warship, twisted metal, broken timber, and men struggling to stay afloat in water cold enough to steal breath within minutes. Sailors leaned over railings, extending ropes and nets, pulling survivors aboard with hands trembling from exhaustion rather than hesitation. Victory had been won, yet it confronted them now not as an abstract triumph, but as human faces, some dazed, some silent, some weeping into the blankets handed to them. Maritime warfare had a way of stripping away rhetoric, leaving only individuals caught in its machinery. Those rescued spoke little. A few murmured thanks, others simply stared across the waves where Bismarck had disappeared. British sailors, hardened by years of conflict, recognized the expression. It was the same hollow look seen in their own ranks after Dunkirk, after the Blitz, after every moment in which survival seemed less a reward than an unexpected burden. For a brief time, enemy and ally stood side by side on the decks of British ships, bound not by nationality, but by the shared experience of having witnessed something immense and irrevocable. Aboard King George V and Rodney, admirals and staff began piecing together the operations lessons. The pursuit of Bismarck had mobilized a significant portion of the Royal Navy, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, carriers, and aircraft working in tenuous coordination across thousands of miles. Yet despite this vast assembly of steel and firepower, the decisive moment had hinged on a single torpedo strike delivered by an aircraft regarded almost as an anachronism. All the might of the surface fleet would have proven insufficient had the swordfish failed in their mission. It was a truth that would ripple through naval theory long after the wreck settled on the seabed. When the swordfish pilots finally returned to Ark Royal, they were greeted not with grand ceremony but with quiet respect. Their faces were drawn, their clothing soaked with salt and oil, their voices subdued after hours spent fighting wind, water, and the limits of their fragile machines. Many did not yet know the full extent of what they had accomplished. To them, the sortie was simply the latest in a series of dangerous tasks assigned to men of their trade. Only later would they learn that their torpedoes, especially the one that jammed Bismarck's rudder, had altered naval history in a way few moments ever do. Within the Admiralty, analysts traced the battle's implications with sober clarity. Naval aviation had long been recognized as important, but now its supremacy over battleships was undeniable. The engagement proved that the dominion of heavily armored surface vessels was drawing to a close. Even the most formidable warship could be crippled by aircraft too slow to outrun a car, too old to impress the designers of modern fleets, yet perfectly suited to their task. The paradox unsettled traditionalists and emboldened innovators. The age of the battleship had not ended suddenly, but the swordfish's flight marked the moment the decline became unmistakable. Around the world, observers took notice. Naval attachés, strategists, and shipbuilders studied every detail of Bismarck's destruction, each drawing the same conclusion. Firepower alone no longer determined sea control. Armor could be outmaneuvered, size could be outthought. What mattered now was reach, aircraft that could strike beyond the horizon, pilots capable of operating in conditions that nullified conventional defenses, and carriers that brought entire squadrons to any point on the globe. Even primitive machines, when guided by skill and necessity, could render steel giants vulnerable. For Britain, the victory carried a dual meaning. It avenged the loss of Hood, restoring a measure of national pride at a moment when morale was fragile. Yet it also highlighted the cost of such triumphs. The rescue operations, the shattered survivors, the empty sea marking the spot where a great warship had vanished. These served as reminders that warfare, even at its most necessary, left scars that no celebration could fully conceal. In the broader story of the war, the destruction of Bismarck became a turning point, not simply because a powerful enemy ship was removed from the Atlantic, but because it exposed the future through an artifact of the past. Innovation does not always arrive dressed as the future. Sometimes it wears the past, weather-beaten and fabric-skinned, rising from a storm on wings no one expected to matter. And as the fleet turned for home, the winds quieted, leaving behind an ocean that had once again rewritten the laws by which power at sea would be measured. In the weeks that followed the sinking of Bismarck, naval strategists across the world confronted a truth that had been building quietly for years but had now revealed itself unmistakably. The era of the battleship, the age of towering guns, heavy armor and gunnery duels fought over the horizon, was drawing to a close. What had undone Germany's most advanced warship was not another battleship, nor a salvo of superior shells, but a single torpedo dropped from a biplane whose design belonged to an earlier generation of aviation. Doctrine, long rooted in the supremacy of steel, was forced into a period of painful reevaluation. In Britain, the Swordfish became more than a humble torpedo bomber. It became a symbol of transition. Naval officers who had once viewed carriers as auxiliary vessels suddenly recognized them as the centerpiece of maritime power. The story of the Swordfish was retold not for its novelty, but for what it represented: an aircraft with minimal speed, outdated construction, and almost no defensive capability had succeeded where cruisers and battleships had failed. It was proof that aviation did not need modernity to achieve impact. It needed opportunity, conditions, and the right alignment of weaknesses to exploit. The improbability of the Swordfish's success highlighted the inevitability of the shift toward air power. Germany, meanwhile, wrestled with the implications of the loss. The Kriegsmarine had invested heavily in the concept of the surface raider, believing that armor, fire control, and sheer scale could offset the growing influence of aircraft. After Bismarck, that assumption collapsed. Reports circulated through the Naval Command, detailing how a low-speed biplane had evaded predictive fire, how a single hit had crippled the ship's steering, and how ineffective the battleship's anti-aircraft defenses had proven in poor weather. By the time these lessons were fully absorbed, Germany lacked the resources to meaningfully alter its naval strategy. Recognition arrived, but far too late to influence the war's remaining years. The Admiralty in London conducted its own introspection. What struck analysts was not just the superiority of carrier-based aviation, but the improvisation that had allowed it to succeed. The Swordfish crews had modified torpedoes on open decks in storm conditions. Pilots had flown through weather that would ground more advanced aircraft. Commanders had coordinated vast forces across hundreds of miles, relying on incomplete intelligence and instinct refined by experience. Britain had prevailed not because it possessed the most modern tools, but because it adapted, rapidly, creatively, and without hesitation. The lesson resonated through every branch of the armed forces: technological inferiority mattered far less than the ability to make use of what still worked. Across the Atlantic, the United States Navy studied the engagement with particular interest. Even before Bismarck's destruction, the U.S. had begun its shift toward carrier-centric doctrine, driven by Pacific geography and the limits of battleship range. But the Swordfish's achievement provided a dramatic affirmation of the path they were already charting. It demonstrated that aircraft could reach where battleships could not, strike with precision despite adverse conditions, and survive through agility rather than armor. By late 1941, American carriers were no longer considered experimental platforms. They were considered essential instruments of war. The transformation that would shape the Pacific conflict was already underway, accelerated by lessons drawn from the cold waters of the North Atlantic. Other navies, from Japan to Italy to the Soviet Union, also recalibrated their strategies. Some embraced the shift, others resisted it, held back by tradition or limitations in industrial capacity. Yet the global understanding of naval warfare had undeniably changed. Battleships, once the embodiment of national power, were now vulnerable platforms requiring constant air cover. Their guns, so formidable in surface engagements, offered little defense against aircraft approaching at low altitude or from unpredictable angles. In a single confrontation, the hierarchy of naval weapons had been rewritten. What replaced it was not the swordfish itself. That fragile aircraft would soon be retired, but the principle it demonstrated. Aircraft, not armor, determined control of the sea. Carriers, not battleships, would define naval power for the generations that followed. Speed, reach, and adaptability surpassed weight and protection in importance. It was a shift as profound as the transition from sail to steam, driven not by a new technology, but by the realization of what existing technology could achieve when used with ingenuity. And in this transformation lay the deeper philosophical truth revealed by Bismarck's fate. Power is not measured solely by strength, mass, or complexity. It is measured by adaptability, the ability to adjust when certainty dissolves, to find opportunity in constraint, and to see potential in tools that others overlook. The swordfish had embodied this principle with quiet resilience. The world's navies, watching closely, took note. The age of the battleship had not ended in a single day, but its certainty had. And as nations looked toward the future, the horizon was no longer defined by steel towers and massive guns, but by runways at sea and the wings that would rise from them. In the aftermath of the battle, the names of the swordfish pilots began circulating through the Royal Navy, men who had flown into a storm that seemed determined to tear their aircraft apart. Many were young, some scarcely seasoned beyond basic training, yet all had demonstrated a calm precision that belied their limited experience. They had taken off not with confidence in their machines, but with trust in one another, and in the narrow sliver of opportunity the Admiralty hoped they might seize. Their courage was not forged in heroism, but in routine. Years of flying slow circuits over gray seas, perfecting techniques few believed would ever matter in a major engagement. Alongside them were the maintenance crews whose work rarely received attention outside the fleet. These were the men who coaxed the aging swordfish into flight condition, tightening fabric skins, adjusting temperamental engines, and performing hurried repairs in rain, darkness, and violent wind. They worked on open decks where every loose tool threatened to slide into the sea, improvising solutions when parts were worn beyond specification or when instructions did not exist for the conditions they faced. Their craftsmanship was the reason each swordfish rose into the storm at all. Without that unseen labor, no torpedo would have left its cradle. In the days and years after the sinking, German survivors spoke openly about their perception of the swordfish. Many admitted they had never considered the biplane a true threat. Some had mistaken it for a reconnaissance aircraft, too slow and fragile to influence the outcome of a surface engagement. Their disbelief continued long after the battle, as if struggling to reconcile the modest silhouette of the aircraft with the enormity of its impact. The juxtaposition between expectation and reality, between confidence and oversight, became one of the most striking ironies of the entire operation. Naval historians later reflected on the profound contrast of technologies involved. On one side stood Bismarck, a masterpiece of modern naval engineering, equipped with state-of-the-art targeting systems, sophisticated anti-aircraft defenses, and armor forged to resist the fiercest blows of contemporary warfare. On the other side stood an Erker, aft whose top speed barely reached a fraction of the battleship's own, whose wings were covered in fabric rather than metal, and whose simplicity bordered on obsolescence. That such a mismatch could produce history's decisive moment illustrated a timeless truth. Technology never exists in isolation. Its value is measured by circumstance, by the adaptability of its operators, and by the flaws its creators failed to foresee. As the story of the swordfish spread, it took on a symbolic dimension. The aircraft became not merely a historical footnote, but a legend, an embodiment of war's unpredictability and of the humility demanded by innovation. Pilots who had once been overlooked found themselves cited in debriefings, studies, and training manuals. Their actions demonstrated that no weapon, however outdated, could be dismissed outright. Its relevance depended less on its specifications than on the ingenuity and determination of those who wielded it. Naval academies across the world incorporated the event into their curricula. Cadets studied the engagement not simply as an episode of wartime history, but as a case study in misjudgment. They analyzed how assumptions about speed, about modernity, about predictability had shaped German doctrine, and how those assumptions had obscured the potential danger posed by an aircraft dismissed as obsolete. The lesson was clear and enduring: never underestimate what seems outdated. In war, the past often returns in forms capable of reshaping the future. The men who flew and maintained the swordfish did not set out to alter the course of naval warfare. They carried into the battle only the tools available to them, tools rooted in earlier eras, shaped by patience rather than innovation. Yet through their actions, they bridged the past and the future, proving that the measure of a weapon is not found in its age, but in the hands of those who refuse to let it fade into irrelevance. Far below the restless surface of the Atlantic, where light fades into a cold, perpetual dusk, lies the wreck of the Bismarck. Her hull rests on the seabed like a fallen monument, tilted, broken, yet unmistakably vast. The once mighty battleship, built to embody the height of German naval ambition, now serves as a silent reminder of how swiftly pride can be overturned. Marine life drifts through the shattered superstructure, passing through corridors where sailors once moved with purpose and discipline. Time has smoothed the scars, but not the lesson embedded within them. In contrast, the swordfish, a machine so unassuming it was nearly retired before the war began, left no imposing wreckage to etch its legacy into the ocean floor. Most of the surviving aircraft were dismantled after the conflict, their fabric skins and wooden frames giving way to the next generation of metal monoplanes. Yet the swordfish endures in a different way, preserved not through steel but through memory. Museums display its delicate frame with reverence. Pilots and historians speak of it with a mixture of respect and astonishment. It earned its place in military history not through design excellence, but through a moment when determination converged with fate. The attack on Bismarck remains one of the most improbable victories ever recorded at sea. No strategist would have predicted that a biplane already considered antiquated in the 1930s would deliver the blow that decided the fate of the world's most modern battleship. Yet improbability is often the companion of innovation. The swordfish succeeded precisely because no one imagined it could. Its slowness confounded fire control systems. Its flexibility endured turbulence that would tear at other aircraft. And its pilots, trained in an era when aviation was still learning its limits, possessed the instincts needed to thread their way through a storm that both hid and threatened them. Nations studying the event understood that the implications reached far beyond the loss of a single warship. The sinking of Bismarck signaled a shift in how military power would be measured. No longer could fleets rely on armor thickness or gun caliber alone. These were relics of an age when combat unfolded on a single plane, horizon to horizon. Aircraft had introduced a new dimension, vertical, unpredictable, and immune to the assumptions that had governed naval warfare for decades. The old calculus of strength was changing, replaced by one centered on adaptability, reach, and the capacity to strike from angles battleships could not answer. This shift also carried a moral dimension. The downfall of Bismarck emerged not from weakness but from overconfidence. German officers had dismissed the swordfish without hesitation, judging it by appearance rather than capability. Their certainty blinded them to the smallest vulnerabilities, the misaligned rudder, the strain of a storm, the unpredictable path of a determined attacker. Britain, by contrast, placed its trust in what remained available, however. Arfect, improvisation, not flawless machinery, shaped the outcome. In the end, the battle illustrated a truth older than any navy. Arrogance obscures opportunity, while humility makes room for innovation. The swordfish did not defeat the Bismarck because it was superior. It defeated the Bismarck because it survived long enough to exploit a weakness the battleship's designers never imagined would matter. And so the moral reversal settles into history with quiet weight. The future, embodied in steel, engineering, and doctrine, was undone by the past, carried on wings of fabric and wood. That day, an outdated machine changed the trajectory of naval warfare, reshaping the decades that followed. They laughed at the old biplane once. They never laughed again.